Hi everyone. Last night on Tuesday there was a massive demonstration held up in the Citywest Hotel in Saggart in Southwest County Dublin. Now I covered this in a video last night when I was up and attended that demonstration and met with so many people from all around Ireland who travelled up to show support to the residents of Saggart and their surrounding areas in the context of what took place on the previous evening. And of course I met people from Carlow, Wicklow, and I met a woman as well to come up from Newton and Kennedy as well, and had lovely conversations with people who have had enough of the uncontrolled mass immigration agenda, the lack of democracy, the lack of integration, the lack of consultation, and the blatant ignorance shown by the Irish political establishment and running roughshod over community sovereignty, community democracy. Of course, many of the political representatives and TDs and elected councillors did not engage over the last number of months with the residents of Saggart when the information was being pushed out that this was to become a long-term state facility, when the state was to purchase it for €148.2 million of our public money. Now, of course, what has transpired in the last 24 hours has been the commentary from the media that I predicted last night, in terms of the commentary around the thugs and this sort of thuggery that took place last night, in terms of bottles that were thrown at members of An Garda Síochána, the setting light of a police van. And of course nobody can condone any behaviour, but that shows you it's a very small minority of what took place. The overwhelming majority of people that were there, if not all, were all there for the reason and standing up for what happened the previous night, and have had enough of being ignored by the political establishment, which is the same as the residents from Saggart, as I said, who have been ignored and who invited public representatives to many of their events and didn't even get responses from them. But of course, all the public reps met with the Justice Minister yesterday in response to what took place. But what's interesting, apart from the commentary around this, is the deflection, diversionary tactics that are being pursued by the Irish political establishment and by the media. Now, of course, we've known that the perpetrator is in custody currently, and also he got a deportation order in the early part of this year. He was in the country for 6 years and he was still being accommodated in Ireland. Now, currently there's about 500 deportation orders that have been served, but of course, where have they been pursued in terms of being enforced? And of course, Jim O'Callaghan is more interested in having public relations flights with 30 or 40 people on it, trying to make look like he's doing something around this as they move towards this EU migration pact. And next year, with the bureaucrats in Brussels, will decide how many immigrants we should take in, or else pay out of the public purse if we don't take the amount that they tell us to take in. So much for our sovereignty. And also the deflection from the €1 billion that's being spent in this system next year, where 33,000 people are in the system. Now, this is outrageous in terms of the public money that's been transferred into private hands, but also it's the drive towards cheap wages and the low wage economy in Ireland, where 1 in 5 workers are on low pay, where there's no accommodation costs being charged for people. Of course, you can work for next to nothing, can't you? And it suits the big employers, while our young people are forced to emigrate. And of course, it's a deflection from the horrific attack on the young child. And of course, our thoughts and prayers are with that young child who has suffered from that unimaginable crime inflicted on her. And also in terms of the state agencies, TUSLA. Of course, TUSLA themselves have been mired in controversy with the amount of missing children, the trafficking that's going on, even outside of TUSLA, for instance, across the missing children. It's absolutely outrageous to what's taking place in our society, and should be really disclosed and investigated properly and thoroughly, not these sort of reviews that the government come up with. Because recently there was over €10 million that was paid across to a person who was a fraudster who was in receipt of a deportation order himself as well, and claiming false references and all this type of nonsense going on that I've covered in quite a number of videos previously. And of course, they said O'Callaghan has been coming out, and the political establishment have coming out and say they appreciate the Gardaí's response. Now, let's get into a few facts on the Gardaí's response in terms of the heavy-handedness. We've seen the Gardaí move towards a paramilitary style policing, away from the whole model of community policing by consent. And that has been the foundation block, really, of the police force since the foundation of the state, in terms of being on the ground, engaging with people, communicating with them, Last night there was no communication, no engagements. There was just people who were looking for an excuse to target people who were standing up against the government's uncontrolled mass immigration agenda. That's what it's fundamentally about, and to scare people off from going to protests. And you've seen the attacks on journalists, but 2 to 3 journalists were attacked. One I've seen where it was pushed to the ground, shunted to the ground by a Gardaí holding a shield, a member of the public order unit. Of course, we've also seen another journalist that was pepper sprayed, and another that was hit with a baton who was just recording on a public road the events that were taking place and documenting them last night without being antagonistic towards anybody. And other women being pepper sprayed also last night. And of course, this is the narrative that's being pursued by the government's agenda. And of course, O'Callaghan has come out and said he is grateful for the forceful response by the Gardaí. But wouldn't he say that? Absolutely just outrageous. It shows you it's just become, we've seen that happen in areas and working class communities around Dublin, such as Coolock. We've seen it happen in Newton and Kendi, the heavy-handedness, for instance, of the Gardaí. And we've seen it also in other parts of Ireland. And he also said that this should not be weaponised. Well, they were the ones to weaponise it. As I said in my earlier contribution around the deportation orders, the €1 billion that's been spent on this system, the money maker racket essentially what's taken place in Irish society. But of course, O'Callaghan won't talk about those issues as he tries to work around the politics of condemnation pursued by other leaders such as Holly Cairns of Social Democrats, who said that the organisers were looking at creating chaos and division in society. Well, it's interesting because their policies, as part of the political establishment, are creating chaos and division and preach and smear and talk down to ordinary people and don't engage with them. Because as I said earlier, many of these public representatives, such as elected representatives, councillors, TDs, were invited to many events by the Sagard residents and ignored them in terms of not coming to those events, not representing them. And they were disregarded. There are issues around lack of services, issues around safety in their communities. There's been many reported issues of events taking place in the Citywest Hotel that Jim O'Callaghan himself has said there's no links between migration and crime. Over 170 incidents were reported, and that was due to a Freedom of Information request that was investigated by a resident of Sagard. So this is ordinary people doing the jobs that the so-called authorities should be doing to keep people safe when they're trying to proclaim that they're keeping people safe, and they're doing nothing of the sort. And they're the ones that are pushing the politics of chaos and division themselves. So they're really trying to gaslight the people of Ireland. And O'Callaghan also revealed something in an interview today. He also said there's 1,200 people from Ukraine there, beneficiaries of temporary protection, which is due to expire in early 2026. But of course, we know the Irish government are great at putting their hands up in Brussels, and as they move towards the EU Migration Pact, that's going to be bureaucrats in Brussels who are going to decide how many immigrants come into Ireland. And in terms of that, if we don't take the set amount, they'll be paying back out of the public purse, because of those bureaucrats in their office will decide based on probably our GDP figures or the size of the Irish economy. And of course, we know the economy in terms of the richest in society, top 10% have 50% of the wealth. And of course, as more money gets funneled upwards in society, this is more of the same, just a kick at the working classes of society. So it's blatantly a class issue, the immigration chaos that's taking place right across society. It's as clear for anybody to see. But of course, the so-called opposition will not regard this whatsoever. They're in cahoots with the government and supporting their policies, much the same they've done over quite a number of policies that the government has pursued over the last period of time. And that's why the media, the protagonists, are quite willing to pursue this agenda. Of course, organisations like RTE, under 725 million over the next 3 years, will work on those politics of condemnation and start say it's galling, it's disgraceful, it's despicable, they're thugs and all this sort of stuff, to try and keep smearing people. But people have wised up to them, and more people are wising up to what's taking place in society. They've had genuine, legitimate concerns about so many issues that are taking place. There's no democracy in Irish society, there's no community sovereignty, there's no local democracy, and everything is being brushed under the carpet. And then when people stand up, they are smeared, they are then battened or beaten off the streets or pepper sprayed off the streets by a police force that is the antithesis of a policing by consent force in Irish society. So this is the reality of what's taking place in Ireland, in Dublin, in Citywest last night as well, and full support to all those residents and all those people who went out. I met many last night from various parts of Ireland, who would come up and showed support for that poor young child, the 10-year-old child, absolutely horrific. And that's the focus of this. And there should be no distraction, diversion to what's taking place in society. These people need to be held to account. They need to be held culpable, and they're fully responsible in terms of their policies and continuing to gaslight and attack and smear the people of Ireland, and batting them off the streets perhaps if they don't like them standing up for the truth and standing up for what's right in our society in terms of having a say in the policy. And of course that's our constitution right under Article 6, where the policy is supposed to derive under, as I say, supposed to derive under God from the people of Ireland. But of course they ignore all this when it suits their narrative and it suits their presidential selection candidates as well. In the context of them both commenting on mass immigration agenda, pursuing a low wages agenda for the workers as well. Both proclaim we need workers, we need it for the economy and all this type of stuff. So it shows you there's a massive democratic deficit in Irish society, but the real democracy comes from communities, it comes from below, it comes from the streets, and it shows you that ordinary people have had enough up and down the country, and that showed with so many people who were there in Citywest last night. So don't fall for a lot of the spin that's been spun about what's taking place. Don't fall for a lot of the nonsense, and make up your own mind based on the facts and evidence presented in front of you. Thanks so much for the support, really appreciate it, and slán go fóill. Take care, bye bye.